In 2002, inside an anthropology laboratory at the University of Tennessee, a scientist was holding a skull excavated from an 18th century cemetery deep in the Appalachian Mountains. Everything looked ordinary until he turned it over. At the base of the skull, right where the head meets the back of the neck, there was a clearly visible bony protrusion, a distinct anatomical feature he had only ever seen documented in skeletal remains excavated from one specific region on Earth, Anatolia, modern-day Turkey. Not Virginia, not Tennessee, Turkey, 9,000 kilometers away. Now stop for a second, reach your hand to the back of your head right now, feel along the base of your skull where it meets your neck. Do you feel a bony bump protruding outward? Comment the number 1 if you feel it, comment 0 if you do not, because your answer might connect you to one of the most extraordinary unsolved mysteries in American history. A community that was erased by law, ignored by science, and is now being brought back to life one strand of DNA at a time. For most of American history, the answer seemed simple enough. The Melungeons were described in textbooks as a triracial isolated group, a mixture of European settlers, African Americans, and Native Americans who retreated into the Appalachian Mountains of Tennessee and Virginia sometime in the 1600s. The name Melungeon itself first appeared in written records in 1813. Nobody agreed on where the word came from. Nobody agreed on who these people really were. The most widely accepted story went like this. A handful of European colonists, cut off from mainstream society, intermarried with local Cherokee and other indigenous peoples over generations. Their darker complexions, their isolated mountain communities, their refusal to integrate, all of it was explained away by that simple three-way racial mixture. It was a neat explanation. It fit the existing framework. Historians repeated it. Schools taught it. There was just one problem. If that story were true, a European and Native American ancestry could not produce a skull with an anatomical feature indigenous to the Middle East. And yet, there it was, sitting on a laboratory table in Tennessee, waiting for someone brave enough to ask the right question. Let us talk about what this feature actually is. The occipital bun is a rounded, shelf-like protrusion of bone at the lower rear portion of the skull. It is a real, documented anatomical variation. You can feel it with your fingertips. In modern forensic anthropology, it is classified as a non-metric skeletal trait, meaning it is inherited, not caused by environment or lifestyle. Here is what makes it significant. Population studies of skeletal remains across Europe and the Middle East have consistently documented a higher frequency of occipital buns in ancient specimens from Anatolia and the Levant, the region covering modern Turkey, Syria, and Lebanon. The feature became rare in most Western European populations thousands of years ago. So when researcher Brent Kennedy, himself a descendant of Melungeon families, began systematically documenting physical traits within the community during the early 1990s, what he found in Wise County, Virginia stopped him cold. He documented the occipital bun appearing at a frequency that could not be explained by European or Native American ancestry alone. His findings were published in his 1994 book, The Melungeons, The Resurrection of a Proud People, and they ignited a debate that is not fully settled to this day. The occipital bun was not the only anomaly. Researchers also documented elevated rates of familial Mediterranean fever within Melungeon-descended communities. This is a hereditary inflammatory disease that occurs almost exclusively in people with ancestral roots in the Mediterranean basin and the Middle East, including Turks, Arabs, Armenians, and Sephardic Jews. It is written into the DNA. It cannot be faked, and it cannot be explained by Appalachian heritage. Two separate biological signals, both pointing to the same region of the world. In 2012, the most comprehensive genetic study ever conducted on Melungeon descendants was published in the Journal of Genetic Genealogy. Led by researchers Roberta, Estes, and Jack Goins, the study analyzed DNA samples from hundreds of individuals with documented Melungeon family lines. This was not speculation. This was population genetics. Think of a haplogroup like a family surname written inside your DNA. It does not tell you everything about who you are, but it tells you where one branch of your ancestry came from thousands of years ago, with a precision no written record can match. The results were striking. The majority of paternal lineages, meaning DNA passed from father to son, fell into haplogroup R1b, that is Western European, expected, consistent with colonial-era settlement patterns. But a statistically significant portion of Melungeon paternal lines carried haplogroup E1b1b. This haplogroup originated in East Africa, migrated into the Middle East, and spread heavily into the Iberian Peninsula, meaning modern-day Portugal and Spain, as well as across the broader Mediterranean. It is not a Western European signature. It is a Mediterranean and Middle Eastern one. Here's the analysis this video wants you to consider carefully. Two completely independent lines of evidence, skeletal morphology and population genetics, arrived at the same geographic conclusion without coordinating with each other. That convergence is not coincidence. The most evidence-supported hypothesis is this: a portion of Melungeon ancestry traces back to Portuguese sailors and Sephardic Jewish refugees, people expelled from Spain and Portugal in 1492, who reached the shores of North America before English colonization began, intermarried with indigenous populations, and whose descendants eventually retreated into the Appalachian Highlands. Their bodies carried the memory. Science just finally learned how to read it. Understanding who the Melungeons were biologically is only half the story. Understanding what was done to them is the other half. By the early 1800s, the Melungeon communities of Newman's Ridge in Tennessee had built something: farms, families, generations of roots pressed into mountain soil. They paid taxes. They voted. They existed, fully and legally, as free people on American land. Then came 1834. That year, Tennessee ratified a new state constitution. One clause was revised quietly, without fanfare. The right to vote was restricted to free white men. The phrase free white became a legal weapon. Melungeons, already viewed with suspicion because of their darker skin and ambiguous origins, were reclassified in court documents and local records as free persons of color, a legal designation that, in the antebellum South, meant losing virtually every civil right at once: the right to vote, the right to testify in court against a white person. In many cases, the right to hold the land they had farmed for decades. Families were taken to court and stripped of property they had owned for generations. Men like Vardy Collins, one of the most prominent early Melungeon landowners, watched the legal ground disappear beneath him. And so the community made a devastating survival calculation. They erased themselves. Families changed their surnames to sound more English. They stopped speaking Portuguese or any other language that marked them as foreign. They instructed their children never to ask questions about where the family came from. Entire genealogies were quietly buried. The Melungeons did not simply disappear from history, they hid themselves inside it, wearing Anglo names like borrowed coats, because visibility had become dangerous. Mahala Mullins, perhaps the most famous Melungeon figure of the 19th century, lived on Newman's Ridge and became a local legend, partly because she was so physically large that authorities who wanted to arrest her on smuggling charges could not figure out how to bring her down the mountain. Her story became a symbol of something larger, a people too stubborn, too deeply rooted to be fully removed. They bent. They did not break. Today, researchers and genealogists estimate that somewhere between 200,000 and over 1 million Americans may carry Melungeon ancestry without knowing it. The erasure was that thorough. The surnames were changed that completely. The silence was kept that long. But DNA does not stay silent. Go back to that moment at the beginning of this video. The hand on the back of your skull. The question about the bony bump. This is not about proving you are Melungeon. Human anatomy is complex, and no single physical trait defines ancestry on its own. But that exercise points to something real and worth sitting with. Our bodies store history in ways that language and memory cannot. The shape of a skull outlasts the name carved on a gravestone. A genetic haplogroup survives centuries of forced assimilation. The Melungeons did everything a community could do to disappear on paper. They changed their names, they burned the evidence, they taught their children to forget. And still, here we are in the 21st century, reading their story back out of bone and blood. The Melungeons were not erased by history. They erased themselves to survive it. And that distinction matters. Because survival, even invisible survival, is its own form of defiance. The bones remember what the records forgot. If you have ever taken a DNA ancestry test and received results pointing to the Mediterranean, the Iberian Peninsula, or the Middle East when your family always told you something different, share that story in the comments below. You might be part of this history without ever knowing it. And if this video made you